is Michelle Mowdy. I'm a developer advocate here at SAP. I typically focus on the topic area of SAP Web Component libraries and how to connect them to modern front-end frameworks. Today I'm going to be talking to you about Svelte, a framework that prior to this presentation I really had no real knowledge of other than it's something that existed. This means that the code you're going to see today is something that I've managed to put together in just a small amount of time with skimming of docs and a whole lot of Googling. I'll talk to you about what Svelte is, why you might choose it over other front-end frameworks, my experience learning it for the first time, and how you could use it to create an app that you didn't even know you needed. So what is Svelte? Svelte is a framework created in 2016 by Rich Harris that utilizes the compiler to create highly optimized vanilla JS. At its core, it extends HTML by allowing JavaScript expressions in markup. It extends CSS by allowing components to define styles using a scoping mechanism. And it extends JavaScript by reinterpreting specific directives of the language. The basic file structure is a script tag, a style tag, and HTML elements or components to make up a single component. If you add a bunch of these together, you can create an entire application. My experience with Svelte can be summed up in 2 words: not bad. It was really easy for me to be able to pick up, and I was able to get the Svelte template down on my computer and up and running and modifying it left and right in just a few minutes of reading the documentation. Of course, that wasn't quite enough for me to get what I wanted out of it, so I had to go through the Svelte interactive tutorial, and after an hour or 2 of that, I was able to jump right into the project that I had planned for this presentation. There was one downside that I found, in that because it's a relatively young framework, only about 7 years old, the community surrounding it is much smaller than what I've experienced with a front-end framework like Angular or React. Which basically meant that Stack Overflow didn't already have the answer to the questions I was asking, and I had fewer examples to pull from on the internet. To bottom line it, I had a very easy time picking it up and really enjoyed the process, but I might be a little reluctant to use it for a large-scale application just because there's a lack of examples and community out there. Not to say that there isn't a community, just a smaller community. I hope that Svelte continues to pick up over the years and gains in popularity. So why would I choose Svelte over other more popular frameworks? Well, for example, if I had a new project that I was starting and my team was mostly filled with junior developers who hadn't had much experience with front end or development in general, Svelte might be a really good choice. I found it to be highly approachable with a very shallow learning curve due to it being relatively basic in features added on top of the vanilla JS, but was incredibly powerful in the things that it was doing. I also found it to be very easy to handle and manipulate data. Most of my experience in development has been with using React, and I gave some presentations last year on Redux and Redux Toolkit, which are added state management and stores added on top of the just basic React, and they're very powerful. Redux Toolkit makes it far simpler to use. However, there are added packages that you need to add to your application, and you have to maintain them, and there's a lot of setup involved with both of those 2 packages that just can make it a frustrating choice. Svelte, on the other hand, has a lot of these things already built in. For example, like Redux, Svelte has a store, which doesn't require any kind of setup in order to start using. There's also the ability to bind variables to your components. So if you have an input field and you want to bind a variable to it so that when the input field has text added to it, this variable is updated dynamically. It happens with a single word that you add to your code, which I found really, really nice. Also, another thing that I really appreciated from Svelte is that sighted people aren't the only ones who can use the internet. There are many tools out there for visually impaired folks, but it's up to us developers to make it easier for those tools to work. Unfortunately, in my personal experience, when things get busy, accessibility is one of the first things to fall to the side. And when we get back into it, it can be easy to miss where accessibility has been added and where it hasn't. Svelte has a built-in tool called Ally, spelled A11Y, that shows warnings on build and during the actual coding process when accessibility features haven't been added but should have been. And I will always appreciate a company that helps make sure everyone can use their product regardless of their abilities. So this is a huge plus for me. Before we start building our application that we're going to be doing today, I think it's important to take a moment to get a brief overview of what a Svelte component, most of where our code's going to be, will look like. It has this basic structure. You have your script tag on top, which is where all of your functions, variables, imports, basically almost, if not all, of your JavaScript will be going. And then at the bottom, you have this style tag, which holds all of your CSS styles and classes. And if you remember, these are actually scoped to your component. So if you have a paragraph over here and a paragraph over here, and you want to color one blue and another one green, those styles won't conflict when you build your application. And then in the middle here, and this is a personal choice for me, just because I like having my code and then what the code is immediately applying to, and then my styles down at the bottom. In the middle, you have all of your elements, be it HTML elements, custom components, components from libraries, that kind of stuff. And one of the things that I noticed that was really different from React in Svelte, you don't have to have a single parent element housing all of the rest of your elements. It was a little weird to get used to, and you'll see a lot of those habits still in the code to come, but it was actually kind of freeing to not be forced to use a single element in the parent. And now I can just have an entire list of paragraphs if I wanted to. The application that I decided to build using Svelte is the Rubber Duck Debugger, which is a debugger that you never even knew that you needed. If you don't know why a developer might need a rubber duck, well, it's actually a relatively common technique for trying to debug issues. A lot of people have found that a very good way to get unstuck in their problems is to just talk it out. Talk about what the code is doing, what it's supposed to be doing, all the things that you've tried, what the problem is, and how to uncover solutions that weren't previously very obvious. Sure, you could go grab a friend or a developer who actually knows what they're doing, and you can talk it out with them and get some actual, back and forth help, but sometimes it's not always the best idea, especially when your issue is you forgot to save a file or misnamed a variable, and that can be very embarrassing. It might also be 3 a.m. because you still haven't fixed your bug and you just need to talk it out with someone. Enter the duck, a simple rubber duck that sits on your desk and is now your best friend. The duck is always available and will quietly listen while you go through your stuff without any kind of judgment. You never need to worry about your new duck best friend thinking less of you or really just judging you for all of the silly mistakes that you make when you code. And you might be asking, well, why would we need a program when we can just go buy or find a rubber duck at the store? Well, reason one is mostly so you can go to other developers and say, look at you with your low-tech rubber duck. Didn't you know there's an app for that? Reason number two would be that if you're in the office, instead of looking like a crazy person talking to a rubber duck, you can go into an office or a meeting room and put on some headphones and open up your computer and look like you're in a meeting instead of talking to yourself like you lost a few of your marbles. But three, one of the actual real benefits of writing a program would be that we can make the duck actually talk back. It can give you some basic debugging techniques like, have you tried turning it off and on again? You could also use it to save notes on what you've done in the past. So if you've already saved your file, or checked to make sure that your files are formatted, or made sure that your application is actually running, you can go back into the history and check and make sure that you've done that before going to do it again. So that's what we're building today, your new duck best friend, to help you get through the silly problems. And with that, let's get on to the actual coding. I won't be able to go through the entirety of the coding process in this presentation. The application just ended up being too large, and no one really wants to see or hear me code for that long or talk for that long. I sped through a lot of the setup code, but I will be sure to go over all of the added code, and then we can add all the Svelte important functionality together. So my preferred IDE is VS Code, and luckily for me and anyone else who likes to use VS Code, the Svelte team has actually created and maintains a Svelte extension, and you can find that by going to the Extensions tab and searching for Svelte. You'll know you found the right one when it says Svelte for VS Code, and it has the Svelte team as the author. You can click the install button to get it going. I've already got it installed, so I don't need to do that. One thing I do want to mention is that there's actually two different versions of Svelte. There's the basic Svelte and there's SvelteKit. I chose to use the basic Svelte. It's a lot less overhead and like I said, pretty basic. SvelteKit would be really helpful when you're doing something more like a multi-page application or something much larger than this single-page application that holds a rubber duck. And luckily, they have templates for both Svelte and SvelteKit. The Svelte template uses Vite to set up, so I'm going to go ahead and get that process started. I'm using the command Vite at latest, and I'm giving it the name of the application, Rubber Duck Debugger. It's going to run here real quick, and then it's going to give me several options. Since we are doing a Svelte project, I'm going to select Svelte, and then JavaScript. Now it's created just the basic framework, and I'm going to go ahead and open up a new coding window with the Rubber Duck Debugger. The next step in the process is just like what the returned output in the terminal was. I need to do a npm install to install all of the packages. Now that we have the project set up and the packages installed, let's take a look at what the project looks like at this moment. I'm gonna ignore a lot of these configuration files. They're just not very useful. I never play around with the configuration files when I use a template. They're a lot. But I always take a look at the package.json file. This is where I look to see what kind of scripts were added and the dependencies that were installed. I'm also a very forgetful person, and I will forget how to start an application if it's been 2 days. So package.json is my friend to figure out how to start the application, which is this dev script right here. Now the starting point of this application is this index.html file. In here we have our head, which sets up our tab, header, label thing. We've got this Vite icon and this Vite plus Svelte. Later on I'm just going to go ahead and change this to make it more rubber duck themed. And we've also got our body here, which has this div with an ID of app and it's empty. And then we have a script calling this main.js. And if we go into main.js in this source folder, we can see that this is the start of the JavaScript part of the application. We import this component, which is a Svelte component, and then we grab that div with the app ID and set up a new app from it. So let's take a look at what app looks like. And I'm going to go ahead and close this terminal so we can see a little bit more of the code at one time. So you can see this has the exact same basic format as what I showed in the PowerPoint. We have this script tag up at the top with some import statements. We have this section here with all of the HTML markup, and then down here at the bottom we have the style component, which references all of the classes that are used in this component. And if we look at the HTML, since there's not much else really interesting here, unless you find CSS interesting, it's not me, I avoid it. We have 2 A tags here, which contain an image. So we've got 2 logos, which will both redirect to 2 different websites, the Vite and the Svelte website, respectively. A header, and this class with a custom component called counter. One thing you'll need to understand with Svelte is that all of the Svelte components have to start with a capital letter. And then down below here, we just have 2 paragraphs, and that's pretty much all that there is interesting in this file. In counter, we have some actual functionality, which is exciting. We have this button down here and some functionality at the top here. We are initializing a count variable at 0, and then we have this function here called increment, which adds 1 to count every time it's called. And we have a button down here that uses a event called click and sends in this increment function. And then for the button text itself, it has count is and then this count variable. Svelte uses these curly braces inside of the HTML markup to indicate these are JavaScript expressions. So here we've got our function, like I said before, and count. What I would expect when this component is on the page is I would see a button that says count is and on initialization 0, and when it's clicked, it would call this increment function to add 1 to count, and then this label, this text here, would update with the current value of count. So we've gone through pretty much all of the relevant code in what Vite has set up for us. So let's go and run our application and see what the page looks like right now. As we can see, we do have those 2 logos, this header here, a button, and then these 2 paragraph elements. And when we click the button, the counter and the does go up and the label does increase. So wonderful, exactly what we would expect. I'd be a little disappointed if the code in the template didn't work as it should. So yay. So the point of this presentation isn't just to talk about Svelte, it's also to talk about how to connect Svelte with the UI5 Web Components library and use those components in a Svelte application. The setup here is actually relatively simple, and we can see how to do so using the UI5 Web Components documentation, and I'll show you that here. I also have a link to this in the description below in case you wanted to check it out. So here in the UI5 Web Components, we can see that there are a few different Web Components libraries. The Web Components Fiori, and Web Components icons. And the install instructions for it for an already created application is just npm install UI5 Web Components. If you've used Node or done some JavaScript applications in the past, this is probably pretty standard, but I wanted to point it out anyway. What we're going to be using at this point in the application is just the web components, just the main library. This contains quite a few components, all styled in that lovely Fiori aesthetic. So if you're looking for just some basic buttons or a calendar or even just to access the icons, all you would need is this main library. Now let's go back and stop our program and run the npm install. While that builds, we're going to go and take a look at the button component, because while this button is great and all, it's missing a certain flair to it that, you know, UI5 and Fiori really brings to the table. So if we go back to this documentation here, we can actually get all of the info that we need to start to reference this button. We have the button, which library it's in, the UI5 Web Components, which is exactly what we're just installing right now. And then we have this UI5 button tag. You'll notice that most, if not all, of the UI5 components start with this UI5 dash to help differentiate it from the basic HTML elements. Then we also have this import statement down here, which I'm going to go ahead and copy for later. This will help us just import the button into our component without having to try hard. These documents are actually pretty handy. They have all sorts of information. You can see all of the properties available on the button component. There's also this little demo right above the properties that you can see, just a basic demo of what the component will look like, and you can see how it's been coded. So here it's just the UI5 tag and the button text. Not very extensive, but in this case it doesn't need to be. And a lot of the times at the bottom, you'll see more examples of what and how these components can be used. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at our application. The install has finished, so let's go ahead and start this. Then we'll put that away so we have a little bit more screen here. And the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and import my button. It's just a basic import statement, nothing else needs to be done here. And I'm going to go ahead and just copy this button and replace it so that we have two buttons of the same type, so we can immediately compare and contrast what the different buttons look like. With this second button, I'm going to add the UI5 to the tag so that the code knows to reference the correct component. And now you'll see our first ally warning. This is basically saying that a click handler has to have an ARIA role. So notice how the ally warning popped up. This is because we need to add some accessibility properties to any given button. And we're going to do that by adding the role property of button. And we're also going to add a tab index, as I know that's what this next warning is about. And now, no more ally warnings, and we have completed our accessibility for this button. So to save that, let's go take a look at what the web page looks like now with our added button. So here's the old button, here's this new UI5 button, which looks great. And I think one good thing about this is if you click one, the count will increase on the other because they're both referencing the same variable. So yay! Now that we've kind of seen the basic structure of a Svelte application and seen how we can add a UI5 web component to a Svelte application, I'm going to go ahead and add all of the code to get us to a good starting point for learning some of the more extensive features of Svelte. I'm going to go ahead and just speed through this, and after I'm done, I'm going to point out all the things that I've added. All right, with all that code speedily added, let's start at app.svelte. So in app.svelte, we have all of these import statements here. And one thing I want to note is that I have imported a theme. All you need to do to start using some of the different Fiori themes is import this assets and import this set theme from the Web Components base library. Then use this set theme function here to give it the name of the theme we want to be using. And if we come back to the application, you can see that we've got this icon here that I've added just so that we can kind of see a little demo of how the theme is working. We've got this like very wide outline, no arms, a little pocket square, I assume. And if we go here and set the theme to quartz and save, you can see we now have a much thinner outline with just a pocket. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all of this extra theming stuff because we won't need it in the final application. And here we have what our app is going to look like for the remainder of this presentation. We have, like I said, the themes, and then we're also importing a header element and a chat element. We put them into the main container, and that's pretty much all this thing does, is become a container for the rest of the application. In header, it's pretty basic at the moment. All it really is holding a UI5 bar with the SAP logo, a title, and a button that does nothing at the moment. And you can see that here, that when you click it, nothing happens. The more interesting part of the application at the moment is this chat. In this chat, which looks quite similar to app, it has the duck component and the history component. And if we go into duck, we have quite a lot of actual functionality here. It starts with this responses array. It's got a list of 3 responses that contain what the duck will be saying, essentially. And then we have this let current response equals 0 variable that sets what response is going to be showing at any given time. We'll go through this change response in a minute, but this is a function that we have on the duck itself so that when you click a duck, things happen. Here in the HTML, so we have a div that's the duck speech bubble. This contains the response. So this is where we show the response. And then down here we have this image of the duck, which by the way was created by AI. And it has this shaking animation so that when you click it, it kind of jiggles. And I think that's just the neatest thing. The onClick event here is this change response function, which basically says that while there's a current response, while the current response value is less than the responses.length, -1, add to the response. If not, set the response to 0. And this is because the response is basically an index of the array. Because arrays start at 0 and we have current response starting at 0, if it goes past the length of the array or even goes to the length of the array, we're going to be referencing an item in that array that doesn't actually exist. So we need to do the length of the array -1. And then we're just going to, it's just a little round. When it gets to the end, it just goes right back around to the beginning. The next thing that we have in chat is this history component. Now, right now, this history component is pretty boring. It also doesn't have things. Like, I have this little paragraph here telling me to add a text input box so we can do things. And we can't see any of the previous notes. And there's also a button here. That doesn't do anything. So this is the first bit of functionality that we're going to be adding. And to take a look at the history file as it is, we have this import statement for the paper plane. That's the icon on the button. We have this list of the note history, which isn't being referenced anywhere. And then we have this parent div. It's got a class of history that adds some styling, and we have this text area with a paragraph in the place of an input box and a button with no function or onClick function. And this is where all of the notes in note history should live, but currently don't. So the first and easiest thing to do at the moment is actually just to show all of these notes in history. And we're going to do that by using one of the things that Svelte has added into the HTML markup. And we're going to do that by using something that Svelte has added to make these kinds of things easy, which is called a logic block. Now, we're pretty used to different kinds of logic statements that we can use in coding. If you've been coding for a while, things like the if-else statements, each statements, await, those kinds of things. And those 3 have all been added into Svelte and are pretty easy to use. The each logic block is the one we're going to be using for this paragraph. Because note history is an array, we just want to basically iterate through each one of these items here and show the text. So we remove this paragraph and use the curly braces, which indicate that there's some kind of JavaScript logic happening in the HTML markup. And we use this hashtag, which to Svelte indicates the beginning of a logic block. And you can see here some of the different types of logic blocks that we can have in HTML. We're going to go ahead and pick each. And the format of this is basically hashtag each, and then a value, the array that you want to iterate over, which would be note history, and then this next blank space here is what we're going to call each individual item in the array. So in this case, note. And then we're going to get our paragraph element in here and use the curly braces to indicate that we're using some JavaScript of some kind, and just put note right inside. And then we end any of these logic blocks with a slash and then the word that started this whole thing, which in this case is each. If we save and go over to our application, we can see that we can now see all of the items in the array. Let's see how we can access the values in an input. So we're going to do that by replacing this paragraph here. And for the moment, we're just going to use a native HTML element called text area. We're going to give it an ID of notes to text area, give it a placeholder, and that's it. Our text area should be all set up. We can type whatever we want in here, and wonderful. This still doesn't do anything, and we still don't have any access to this. So we're going to get access to it by adding a new variable up here called new note, and give it an empty string. In the text area, we're going to reference that through the value prop and give it new note. And one final thing, so we can at all given times see what new notes look like, we're just going to add this little paragraph here that says new note is new note. Save that, and we can see right now it's blank, and unfortunately, when we try to enter text, nothing is happening. This is because while we've given the text area a value, we're not telling it to do anything when the value changes. And to confirm that we've actually given it a value, we'll add a initial value to new note. And you can see here that it says quack and quack, exactly what we would expect. But if we want to have new note update when text is added into text area, we can do that with a really simple single keyword of bind. Svelte looks at bind and says, okay, whenever anything updates in this text area, we're also going to update this new note value variable. And we'll save that, and when we come here and type, now we can see that new note is actually updating. Yay! So this is wonderful and all, but this text area is pretty ugly. So we're going to go ahead and switch it to the UI5 text area, which is much better looking. So I'll save this, and I will change this to a UI5 text area and save, except now we happen to have an error. This is a consequence of using a component library that's not specifically built for Svelte. However, it's not actually all that complicated to get this same kind of functionality with just a little bit of code. It's unfortunate that we can't use the bind keyword, which I like quite a bit because it's so simple and easy, but it's not too big of a downside, in my opinion, for not having to deal with making that old text area look nice. So I'm going to go and remove this bind, and that removes the error, and I'll save and show you how much nicer this looks. Going back, I'm going to add in an onInput event in this text area. And I'm going to format this so that it's a little bit easier to see what I'm doing. When I use this on colon, it indicates that whatever comes after that is an event. This can be a predetermined event like on input, on click, something like that, or it can be something custom like we'll see a little bit later. And we're going to give it a function that doesn't actually exist yet, which is called is called handle text area input. And we'll write that function up here. Now, if this isn't a familiar... Okay, so this is our function. Now, any event will be sent in an event. And on that event, we can get the value that we need to give new note. So we want to update new note with that new value. We're going to go new note equals event dot target dot value. And this does the exact same thing as what that bind keyword did before. So if we save this and we come back and new note is blank, and now new note is quack. Wonderful. So a little bit extra code, but we get better aesthetics for it. Now, the last thing we want to do in this history section is we want to add functionality to this button here. When we click it, nothing happens, and we want to add quack into our history. So we'll do that very similarly to how we added this on input onto our text area, but instead of on input, we're going to do on click. And we're going to give it handle send button, which once again doesn't exist, and I'm going to format this file, copy that, and I will add the function here with an arrow function. So when we press the send button, what we want to do is we want to take new note and add it to the beginning of note history. And I say the beginning because sometimes you just want to see what you did last. And it's easier to see that what we're adding is actually working instead of having to scroll all the way down to the bottom of history. So we're going to use one of my favorite things in JavaScript, which is the spread function. So we're going to say new note, and then we're going to spread the old history right behind it. This is basically a shorthand way of saying create a new array and put every single element from this array into that new array. Then when we send that note to history, we want to blank out the text area. So we're going to set new note to a empty string. Cool. Save that. And when we come back here, everything should be working properly if I did my job right. So quack, and there we go. Now it's all working. Just a little bit of time, and we've added a text input box, we've added a handler on a button, and we've added a whole history dynamically created based on an array. So I'll remove this little new note as we don't need it anymore. Save this, and now history is complete. So what we're going to do next is we're going to move on to increasing the number of things that our poor little duck can say at any given time. So if you remember before, we have this header here that has a settings button that doesn't do anything. So I am going to spend just a little bit of time adding a settings dialog and a bunch of the boilerplate code so that we don't have to worry about adding that later. And we can just get right into the good stuff of Svelte. So if you give me just one moment. So what I've just done is add the initial settings dialog here and referenced it in header.svelte, but that was just a simple import and component reference. And what this basically does is it uses this onMount function from Svelte, which gets called every time a component is created. And it sets this dialog variable to the element of this response dialog. And we can see that down here in this UI5 dialog component. And through that dialog, we have the close and show functions to open and close the dialog itself. From there, we have the UI5 button, that's this settings button. That's what's showing in the header now. Instead of the old button, we have this button right here, and then we've got this dialog right below. In this dialog, we will eventually have add response, but now we have this add list component that I forgot to uncomment before that I'll talk about in just one second. And then we have the footer and the close button. So this is actually also pretty similar to what chat and app look like. It's mostly just a holder for the individual pieces of logic and functionality that we're going to be adding in more broken down components. In response list, it's pretty simple and actually something that we just saw. We have this array of responses that's actually an array of objects, and we have this each logic block that goes through all of the responses and puts the response description into a paragraph element. If we go look at our application, you can see now that the settings opens up and we have this very admittedly boring list of responses that the duck could say. At the moment, this settings dialog is actually pretty boring and it's missing all of the functionality that it needs. And I actually lied a little bit before when I said that we were going to move on to adding new things for the duck to say. What we're actually going to be doing first is removing things that the duck can say. For when you're really annoyed about it asking if you've tried turning it off and on again. So I'm going to start by adding another component here into settings called response_items.svelte. This is set up to contain the delete button that we need for the array. As of right now, it doesn't do anything because there's no actual data in here. It has this variable item that seems to have an ID and a description on it, except it's never been set. So if we were to import this into another component, nothing would actually show up. Luckily, this is a good opportunity to show how props work in Svelte. And it's pretty simple. If we wanted to let a parent component add data to this item variable and expose it, all we would have to do is write export. And then you could just send in an object that has an ID and a description and bing, bang, boom, things work. And we've actually seen exposed props before in a bunch of other different elements. So like this could technically count as an exposed prop because it is a prop on an element. And this is exactly the syntax that we're going to use to add something to this item. We'll do that here in this each logic block by changing this paragraph with response.disk into a response item. And we're going to say item equals response. And there's something really cool you could do here in Svelte. If you notice, this is item equals response, but we have complete control here over what this variable is named. If we happen to name it item and put it here, this works just like the other way did. But because this property name and this item variable name match, Svelte has a shorthand where you can just remove this item equals part, and this will map exactly as it would if you were more explicit with it. So if we save that and go into our settings, we can see now that we have a much more aesthetically pleasing list of items, of responses, and delete buttons that currently do nothing. Adding the remove functionality for the response items is going to be a little bit more difficult than any of the on-click functions we've added before. Because the responses array is in the response list and the response item needs to delete a response from that list, we will need to use a custom event, in this case, an item delete event. We will have the delete function set up in the response list, so the parent component, and then we will push that function down into response item through the on item delete event, and response item will use a dispatcher to dispatch that event because events don't bubble from nested components in Svelte. So we have to dispatch them. Let's get started by just adding the handle remove function. Now I'm going to copy and paste this just to save a little bit of time. And here's the function. What we're doing is we are passed in an event, then we are creating a new filtered responses that looks for any response in the list that doesn't share an ID with the event details ID, and we will be sending in the ID of the response that's getting deleted through response item. So this is just every single response that doesn't have this ID. And then responses, we just spread this filtered response here and give it a new array. Then to send this function down into response item, all we need to do is add our custom event and send in the remove function. Save that, and in response item, like I said before, we do need to dispatch any of these events sent from a parent item, so we're going to use a function built into Svelte called create event dispatcher, which will send us the dispatching function that we need, and it'll auto import there, which is nice and handy. Then we need to add a function that we can call from our button, and I'll go ahead and copy and paste that here. This is called handle delete press, and it uses the dispatcher in which we send in the name of our custom event or any event that we need here. And then a object that contains an ID and the item ID of this specific item. Down here, we'll add our on click with the new function that we just created. If we save all of this and go to our application, and I'm just going to refresh to make sure that everything is nice and fresh, and we can delete, no problem. One question you might or might not be asking is what happens if you have an event in a parent function that you need to send 2 levels down? Is that going to be really difficult? Do we have to create this whole dispatcher thing and then send this in through an event? The answer is actually no. Svelte has come up with a really quick and easy way to deal with that. And I'll go ahead and move the responses and the handle remove function up into settings.dialog or settings dialog. I'll go ahead and remove all this and add in a prop for our responses array that we're going to send in soon. In settings dialog, we're going to go ahead and add this, the code that we just moved or removed from response list, and add both of these into this response list component. And we'll do that by using the handy short form of sending through values with just these curly braces and no explicitly declared prop. And then just like in response list, we're going to send through the item delete in the same way we sent it in through response item. We'll save that, and the magic happens here. So we no longer have access to this function because it's moved a parent up. In order to move this onDelete event down into the child, all we have to do is remove this, and Svelte knows to move it from the parent through the child onto the grandchild without any real extra code. I thought that was a pretty handy way to handle this kind of situation. I'll save that and we'll go back here just to make sure that everything works properly, and we can still delete, which is great. You might be wondering if now is the time to finally add the adding functionality into the settings dialog. But to make that much easier for us, we're actually going to take a small detour and take a look at the Svelte store. For those who may not know, a store is basically a place where we can store all of the data an application might need in a more centralized location. This is more for use cases where, like we have here in the settings dialog and in Duck, where they both need access to the same exact responses list. Because if the settings deletes an item from the list, we also want to not see that response still in the Duck, which is our current functionality because the responses are all hard-coded. We could move the responses list into the lowest common parent between the two, but that component might not actually need to know anything about the responses. So it's just smarter to take it out of the whole component flow completely and put it in a separate location. That's where the store comes in. And Svelte has this all completely built in, which is very handy and very nice, and I'm enjoying it quite a bit. So to start with that, we're going to go ahead and add the stores file, which is a JavaScript file. And let me go ahead and copy that code in to there. Now we have this default responses, which is much longer than the responses that we have elsewhere in the code, and that's just so that it's really easy to tell when we're using our new responses list versus the one that was already in those components. But the meat of this file is essentially this responses variable here and this writable function that we get from the Svelte store. What this writable function is essentially doing is it's saying that this store value is one that components and other places in the code can actually go and update. There are other types of store values that are just like readable, which is handy for when you want to make sure that other places won't be able to update it because that might break your whole application. But for our needs, we want a list that we can update and add and set to a new list anywhere we please. So we're using writable and we're sending in our default responses to make that the data in responses on initialization. So we'll save this and we're going to go into settings dialog and update this responses that we just added. To make it easy for me, I'm going to go ahead and just remove this so we can see where all the errors occur. And we have 3 of them. We have one here where we filter through the responses. We have one here where we try and set the responses. And we have one here where we're just trying to send the responses through to response list. The first thing I'm going to do is import our new responses. So I'm going to do that just by getting the IntelliSense to do that for me because it's easier. And you'll notice here we're getting some errors. This is because of how Svelte has set this up. This isn't actually just the data, the default data that we sent into it when we initialized it in stores. It's an object that has a bunch of helpful functions along with the data. We could add some code to subscribe to it, but if this component mounted and unmounted a lot, there would be a memory leak. So we'd need to unsubscribe from it. But Svelte was like, that's a lot of boilerplate. So they added a very helpful $sign symbol that we can put in front of any of our store values to say we want to subscribe to the data in this spot, and the compiler will know to set all of that up for us when it compiles it into vanilla.js. So just adding the money sign tells the code that this is just the data, and you can see here that it's a list of responses with an object of ID and description. Here, because we don't need the data itself, we're actually trying to update the data. This is where we would use one of the functions on responses. And in this case, it would be, let me copy this to make things easier on me. It would be set. There are other functions that we'll see a little later on that allow you to just update a store value, but in this case, we want to just replace the whole thing. And now, even though this has disappeared, there is an error here. This is being sent in as the object, and we actually just want to send in the data itself. We can no longer go ahead and just use the $sign because that changes the name of it. So we're going to need to add back the explicit declaration of the prop here. And if we save and go back to our application, we can open up the settings and see that we have a much longer list. And delete still works, which is great. The next place that we would want to update is this duck right here. If you notice, it still has things to say, but we deleted all of them, and that's just not cool. So going into duck, we're going to do largely the same thing that we just did before, except we have another value that we need to add to the store. The way this logic is written out is that if we deleted the wrong object from our array, our application would break because the current response would be referencing an item in the array that no longer existed. For example, if we were referencing the last item in the array and deleted any number of them, the array would shrink and we'd now be trying to access part of the array that just doesn't exist anymore. So because we're deleting items in another part of the code, we should put this value here into the state so that when we delete an item, we can just go ahead and reset this right back to 0. So I'll go ahead and get that code written by going into store and copying my handy dandy cheat sheet over there. So it's just the same as how responses was done. We've got our current response and we've declared that it's writable, and we're setting the default value to 0 because arrays start at 0. In duck, we're gonna remove this to see where all the errors are, and then we're going to call our handy dandy IntelliSense to import it correctly. And anywhere we are referencing the data itself, we're going to add the money sign. And anywhere that we are trying to update the actual value of the response, we're going to use some of the functions on the object itself. Now, this one is very similar to what we were doing before. We're just going to replace this equals 0 with a set 0. In current response, we're actually trying to update the value by adding 1. So there's another function here called where it will send us the current value of the store variable. And then we can do n plus 1, and that will say, hey, take the current value and add 1 to it. Saving this, if we go back to our application, hopefully everything still works. And it does. Wonderful. Now we need to go and use the store value to get the list of responses. Pretty simple. We've seen it a few times already. Remove responses. Go ahead and add the store, and then add $signs wherever the actual data is needed. Save that, and then now when we go back to the application, we should see the entire new list. You can see that with this long one here asking if you've taken a short break to get water or go outside. But now we have a small bug. If we deleted, it was the bug that I mentioned before, that if we delete this last object while we're on the last item in the array, we will get an error because we're referencing an item that no longer exists. So let's go into settings dialog, where we have our handle remove function. And we're going to add the variable and set the object to 0. Or anytime we delete an item from the list, we're always going to be safe by just reverting back to the first one in the list. Now that we can delete all of the responses, there's actually one small bug that's been uncovered. So we have these responses, we can go through and we can delete them, and we'll reset right back to 0, which is exactly what we expected when we just added that new functionality. And if we deleted all of the items in the array, we're going to break the application again, which is not great. So what we're going to do is we're just going to add a if-else logic block to this speech bubble to handle that situation. And we're doing that in Duck right here on line 19. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this code instead of writing it out by hand. So this looks very, very similar to the each logic blocks that we've used before, except now we have this new character here, the colon, which is a continuation character. If you've written any if-else logic conditions in the past, this should look very familiar as well, just with the Svelte logic block syntax. So if responses.length is greater than 0, we will show the response. If not, the duck just doesn't have anything to say anymore. Save that, go back to our application, and since there are no items in the list, the duck doesn't know what to say. All right, refresh this to get all the stuff back. And now, finally, to create our add response functionality. So if we have a new useful quick tip that the duck can tell us when we're regaling our poor duck friend with tales of this bug that's defeated us, maybe next time it won't take so long for us to fix it. So in settings, I'm going to add response.svelte and copy this whole file in. We've already seen all of this code added in bits and pieces in the other components. I didn't think it was really worth y'all watching me code this by hand, but I will go through each of the individual pieces so you can kind of see, again, what was done, and maybe you can pick out which piece of logic and new functionality came from which other component. So we have our response input value here set to a blank string, and we have this function here called handle item input that takes in an event and sets response input value to the event target value. We have a function here called handle add, which is the key functionality of this component, which says if response input value is a truthy true and response input value having trimmed for white space isn't an empty string, we're going to go ahead and add a new response into our responses array using an update. Basically, what this code is doing right here is it's creating a new ID based on the ID of the last item in the array, as long as there is at least one item in the array. This is because the last item in the array is always going to have the highest ID number, so there's not going to be any issues with overlapping IDs. This whole line, by the way, is just shorthand for a if-else statement. It's saying if this is true, do this side of the colon. If not, do this side. Then we create a new object using the same format as the rest of the responses, so ID and description. Description is using the response input value that is updated here in this handle item input. And then for responses, we go ahead and just update the array. So we get the current data in the responses variable, and then spread the old responses and add the new responses at the end. Then we set response input value to an empty string. If this right here isn't true, then we're going to go ahead and just send out an alert saying just please include text before adding, because we don't want to make the duck more empty-headed than they already are. Here we have our HTML elements. We have the UI5 input, so it looks pleasing, with the value here of response input value and the on input event taking in the handle item input. If you recognize these two, that's because we did that in history. It was one of the first things that we did. And then here we have an on-click event for our UI5 button. If we save this and go ahead and uncomment the commented out response code from settings dialog and save. We can go back to the application, check out here, and now we have a nice pretty add bar up at the top, and we can add a new response for our duck. Who doesn't love giving inanimate objects and programs existential crises, am I right? So we add it there, and now we can see it all the way at the bottom. And that's it. That is all the code we're adding for our Rubber Duck Debugger. It is this guy, this new friend is now ready for anyone to come and just word vomit all of their development problems at it, and maybe, just maybe, help you figure out what your bug is. Just to review all the things that we did, we added this input box here and bound it to a variable so that when we clicked this send button down here, we would add it to the history. Like so. We added this settings dialog, created a way to delete responses and add responses. Like so, and we added a way to use the same response list for the duck responses and in the settings. So you can click and see all of the new and old responses. The best part of this whole app is that you can replace your old boring rubber duck with a brand new high-tech duck that actually talks back. That's all I got for you today. You can find a link to the repo with my final solution in the description below. I hope you learned enough about Svelte to know if it's a good fit for you and your next project, and if it is, how to use the UI5 Web Components with it. Have a lovely rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of the Devtoberfest sessions we've got in store for y'all. And as always, happy coding!